All right, welcome to Sci Philipod for the week of February 27th, 2021. Very important week because it is the week of CPAC and the triumphant return of Donald John Trump, which we will not talk about this week.
Yes, very important.
As always, I am your host, Benjamin Weingard, joined by
Your humble co-host, Bo Weingard.
somewhere in the
Still undisclosed location in the Midwest.
yes. So this week we will talk about three topics. First, the COVID hypocrisy and especially Andrew Cuomo's handling of COVID. Then we'll turn to highlighting some rising conservative stars and what they tell us about the conservative movement in the Republican Party. So we'll focus on Kristi Noem, Ben Sasse, Ron DeSantis, and a little bit on Tom Cotton, although we highlighted him last week. And then we'll finish with the article of the week, Ezra Klein's piece in the New York Times that provoked a lot of discussion on California is making liberals squirm, and then the response to it from Kevin Williamson at the National Review.
Indeed.
So let's start with Cuomo. What's going on with him? What happened to Cuomo and the Cuomo sexuals?
So Andrew Cuomo was, you could say, lionized by the media as a tough-minded, scientifically oriented governor grappling with COVID the way that you were supposed to, as opposed to the anti-science red state governors such as Noem and DeSantis, Kemp in Georgia, among others.
Kim Reynolds in Iowa.
Yeah. So Cuomo actually won an Emmy Award for his presentations during the COVID crisis.
Right. So to be clear, Andrew Cuomo is the governor of the state of New York.
Right. Yeah, I should say that.
And he came to prominence because New York was one of the first regions to get slammed by COVID. And obviously the public was looking for some reassurance and someone to tell them what was happening here. And Donald Trump was not good at doing that. Right. So we turned to Andrew Cuomo and his daily press conferences, where he seemed to mix some kind of almost like mafioso type masculinity with some kitchen table common sense philosophy.
Yeah, it was kind of like a mixture of machismo and common sense, practical, science-based, attempt to grapple with the crisis.
Yes. And so his popularity climbed from, it was in the 40s before COVID, and then it climbed up to 72%.
Right. So people have made this comparison, and I think it's germane. It's a bit like Rudy Giuliani in the aftermath of 9/11, because there was the perception that George W. Bush wasn't quite as eloquent, or there was just something off about Bush's response that wasn't quite as gravitating as Giuliani's response.
Yeah.
And I think in the void of the presidential response, which Trump just has a hard time empathizing with people, so he was incapable of conveying, I think, important human emotions that people were looking for. Cuomo stepped in.
Yes.
Now, and also he was used as a foil to these other red state governors because he went hard lockdown and positioned himself as somebody who was taking this very seriously, as opposed to these red state governors who were being more cavalier.
Right. Although he went hard lockdown a little bit late.
Yes. Now, so here comes the crisis. So the problem is that in March, he approved of a plan to transfer elderly people who had tested positive for COVID, but were on the recovery, right? Who were recovering or recovered, to move them back into nursing homes.
Yes.
And New York had a lot of deaths in nursing homes.
Yeah, so to be clear, this directive issued on March 25th.
Yes.
Now, Cuomo claims he was not actually even aware of it.
Right. But the important thing is, so they go in, New York has a very high death rate in nursing homes, but also we discovered through divulged video, I believe, that the Cuomo administration hid data from the public about deaths in the nursing home. So that's kind of the big scandal here that New York Post, for example, reported on, and I think released the video of the woman talking about
so that
disguising.
So March 25th, you have this order. And then importantly, but this hasn't gotten as much attention, on April 3rd, Cuomo signed the state budget. And in that bill, there was a provision that was buried that provided sweeping immunity to nursing homes for taking in COVID positive residents, for taking them back. Now, exactly what was going on there is unclear, but you combined that with the March 25th directive,
right,
and the high nursing home fatality rate in the state of New York, and the fact that they hid the number of fatalities.
I think the worst thing here is that they hid it, because I mean, although critics of Cuomo are slamming him, I think somewhat unfairly, for this directive, because if you look at what was happening, it was a complicated situation, because you had hospitals filling up. So you thought, okay, these are people who are convalesced, who are taking up beds in the hospitals. So it was very unclear what the best way to proceed was. The big crime here is not divulging those data, because that has problems for future decision making. So I think you should be forgiving of people in the middle of a crisis about which we have very little information, and there are very few certainties. Hiding it is the big problem here, I think, especially because Cuomo positioned himself as this person who was taking this seriously, as opposed to these other red state governors, Ron DeSantis, etc. And that's the big scandal here. Now, also turns out another big problem here is that Cuomo is an incredibly belligerent governor who has a long trail of disputes with people, from which the people feel quite aggrieved, right? So a lot of people are already bitter about Cuomo, and they now see him as an injured politician. The blood sort of circulating in the water, and they're coming in at this point, I think, for the kill, to take out this guy. Also, there was an accusation of sexual harassment, but we don't need to get into that. I think the big point here is there's a lot of hypocrisy in the coverage of COVID, because when you look at New York, it's second in fatalities per capita.
That's right, just below New Jersey.
Right, and when you look at Florida, which Ron DeSantis is governor of, when you look at Florida, they're, I think, number 27. But DeSantis was getting absolutely eviscerated by the media. And Cuomo was getting lionized, while their states were performing exactly the opposite of what you would think if you were just paying attention to mainstream media outlets.
Right. Although it's worth noting that, again, New York City got hammered really early, before it was clear how best to respond to the spreading virus. So, I mean, if you look at the worst hit states overall, they're generally the states that were hit first, like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. So I think the overall assessment of Cuomo's handling of the pandemic is somewhat mixed. And also importantly, they didn't hide the overall number of fatalities, right? What they did is they hid the location where the fatalities had occurred. And actually, overall, New York's long-term care facilities weren't that terrible, right? So they were, I think, 10th worst, 48.5 deaths per 1,000 residents, but much better than Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Delaware, etc.
Yeah, right? And it's unclear what even caused, it's unclear if these patients were the main vector for COVID, because in fact, various analysts have argued that it was asymptomatic workers who were the main vector. But so I think the problem is, again, that he was so lionized, and people, understandably, conservatives are a bit angry about the way that he was held up as this sort of model governor, while other red state governors who just statistically their states have done better were berated. That's one thing. Another thing is just Cuomo has a very unpleasant personality, a very belligerent, in your face personality. So he's made a lot of political enemies. And you can see from his February, I think 19th press conference, his response to this is go full bully mode, right? I've been too weak, is what Cuomo's basically coming out and saying. Like, you want to come at me, can come at me and bring it, is his attitude. And you can see that might work, but it's not surprising that you have a lot of people who see him wounded and want to take him out now.
Yes, and including Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York City, because they have a running feud that predates the pandemic, but certainly there was a lot of friction between the two of them during the pandemic. So,
but I think also the story here is just one of media / expert hypocrisy, or let's just group them together and call them, as the populist would, elite hypocrisy about COVID. So again, it's important to be forgiving of people. This was a very tough situation. I don't think it makes sense to criticize people who supported stringent lockdowns as totalitarians or anything. These were people trying to respond to a very complicated and scary phenomenon. However, what you can criticize is the faux certainty and the double standards. And so a good example of this, and Cuomo isn't really directly related to Cuomo, but is part of this theme, is this article that was published in The Atlantic called "Why Health Experts Are Not Hypocrites."
It has to be, by the way, this is one of the most insufferable articles I've ever read.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So here's what happened. If you recall, in April, there were anti-lockdown protests that were seen as right-wing, and probably most of the people there were on the political right, although not all of them. And a lot of these people were protesting maybe because they were losing their job, or their business was in trouble, or they just didn't like the draconian lockdowns. They thought that they were an impingement on individual freedom. So they protested. And they were denounced severely by the media, by liberal outlets, etc. Then, after George Floyd's death, there were huge BLM protests all across the country, and thousands of experts signed things saying that those were the BLM protests were okay, and they were largely applauded by the media. Some conservatives pointed out, isn't this a bit hypocritical? So Julia Marcus and Greg Gonzalez said, oh, no. This might look like hypocrisy to those who do not have the capacity to see through the matrix at reality, but in fact, it's not hypocrisy. And the reason it's not hypocrisy is because you have to weigh all of these factors. And
Mhm.
so according to them, because the life of Black Americans, the lives of Black Americans in America are so precarious,
Mhm.
these protests are actually a good thing. And in fact, I found this just remarkable that they were trying to defend these protests by noting that the people protesting weren't ignorant of the risks.
Yes, I
Right. And
thought
so
that was the most batshit argument
so the quote,
ever.
this person says, they cite this approvingly, by the way. This person says, basically, systemic racism kills more people than the virus. Okay, so here you have health experts endorsing the claim that systemic racism kills more people than the virus, which is on its face absolutely crazy, I
Yeah,
would
just
say.
to be clear, as of now, over 500,000
Right.
Americans have been killed by the virus.
Right. And furthermore, I mean, as they note in the article, but furthermore, Black Americans, for a variety of reasons, some may be related to genetic vulnerabilities, but also related to, life circumstances, are actually more likely to die from the virus than
Right.
white or Asian Americans. So it's just a bizarre claim. And also,
The bizarre claim. It's
I mean,
just a completely false claim.
right. It's not mendacious in the sense that I don't think they know they're lying, but it's completely false. It's erroneous. And the whole article is just this remarkable apologetic for something that's indefensible. It's clearly hypocrisy. Clearly, what's going on is just a political calculation. I like these protests. I didn't like those protests. That's fine. Just admit it. And then I think if you're a health expert, what you need to do is stay out of politics. If you allow politics to influence what you're saying about something, then you will be dismissed by half the population, right? So you should say, I'm not making a claim about if it's worth it or not, but here are the objective risks, period, right? That's what you
Yes.
should be doing as an expert. Otherwise, you're just a partisan, participating in partisan politics, which is fine, but you're no longer an expert, and your opinion should carry no more weight than, say, Charlie Cook at the National Review.
It should probably carry less weight
Perhaps
because they're
less.
explicitly partisan about
Right.
it. Yeah, and the quote that is absolutely dumbfounding to me. So they're referring to the Black Lives Matters protesters, and they say, quote, they are not acting out of ignorance that needs to be corrected by public health experts, unquote.
Right.
Your job as a public health expert is to, as transparently as possible, put out information to people about the risk of different activities, right?
Right.
Including like using your seatbelt, what is the risk of cigarette smoking, etc. Not to judge who needs to be scolded and corrected and who has fully
Right.
internalized the risk, the
Right.
probabilities.
I would like to see the empirical research that suggests that the BLM protesters had a better grasp of the COVID virus
Right.
than
Than
the right-wing lockdown protesters.
Right. And also, to be clear, if you're protesting because your small business is about to go under and you're suffering from some mental illness like increased depression or anxiety, that is not legitimate.
Right.
But if you're
right.
protesting because you're kind of bored and you want to do some rioting and looting, that is okay.
Or because you believe a completely erroneous narrative that police in the United States are hunting down and slaughtering innocent Black people, that is
Yes.
okay, right? I mean, that's
And
the sort of perniciousness of accepting this blatantly ridiculous narrative about.
it's fucking preposterous. And they end the article with this paragraph that's like literally the message is Americans are coming together like never before, both by socially distancing and wearing masks and by engaging in mass protests against systemic racism.
Right.
Like, what in the
So what happened? I mean, if you wanted to, if you thought like, I wonder if experts will self-immolate over the next months, as if they aren't already, as if people aren't already very skeptical of them. The answer is yes, they will, because here's what they did during the COVID crisis. Now, again, this is public experts. It's important to distinguish between people who working behind the scenes, who created vaccines very quickly, and we should be very thankful for them and defer to them on their area of expertise. We couldn't do this. So that's good. Public experts opining publicly, they went from you shouldn't wear a mask. No, I mean, first they went from it's xenophobic to worry about this. And you can find these articles at Vox.
Travel bans are
xenophobic, right? Xenophobia is more dangerous than the virus.
Yes.
You shouldn't wear a mask. Oh, no. You should wear a mask. No, you should wear 2 masks. Protesting is bad. Oh, no. Protesting is okay as long as it's for something that's so important, like Black lives. If you're protesting to save your business, that's not okay. That's actually reckless.
Yes. And so, and then we can't open schools because they're open. Right. Even though the data suggests that
you should.
There
will be a post-holiday massive spike in COVID cases. Oh, wait, no, actually they're going down. So I think what we should take from this is humility. We don't know. Epidemiologists are fucking clueless on a lot of these things, right? And you have to build that into your public relations framework and be more humble when you're talking about it. Oh yeah, and also Cuomo's God. Oh, wait a second. DeSantis is going to kill everybody in Florida. Wait a second.
Yeah, if you don't have draconian lockdowns, half of your population will die.
Right.
Whoops, so guess not.
Unfortunate. Just displaying, and one of the things that has bothered me about the COVID sort of politicization of COVID is that a lot of these people act as though the only politicization is happening on the right with masks, which I don't like. I don't like that masks became this political signal, and some people, especially those on the right, refused to wear them, or they would laugh at people who were afraid of them if they weren't wearing them in the store, as Aubrey Huff and others did. Yeah, that's silly. But the politicization is happening on both sides. It's not one side here, it's both sides. And we should learn to be more humble about these things and try to accept uncertainty.
Yes, and right. I agree 100%. Epistemic humility is important, and public health experts should message on things that they know, and they should convey the uncertainty when they are in fact uncertain. And the media has a real duty to expose politicization on both sides, right? Not just, oh, Kristi Noem and Ron DeSantis are politicizing their response to COVID-19, right? But Cuomo, Whitmer, all of these people who have been hypocritical about BLM protests are not. That's just actually, you can justify that.
I think that's the thing that a lot of people, and we'll see this when we talk about Williamson's article, which I think is a bit unfair, but I think conservatives get angry that there's this vision promulgated by a lot of these educated elites that progressives are just these technocratic pragmatists who pay attention to the evidence and then do the right thing, or at least attempt to. They forward hypotheses and then they work with those hypotheses. Conservatives are driven by a set of prejudices, right? And that's this framework. And so you set it up and it's like, oh yeah, clearly the conservatives are being biased here, and the progressives are trying to grapple honestly with the data and with what experts are telling them, when nothing could be further from the truth. Both sides have their biases, and that doesn't mean that, I mean, there are data that you should pay attention to, but both sides tend to move beyond their epistemic lanes and exercise policies, etc., that are driven by prejudices.
Yeah. And I think it's fair, like on the Black Lives Matter protest, I think it would be fair as a public health expert to conclude that whatever assertions you made, they would be ignored and people would protest anyway. That is perfectly, I mean, that's accurate, but that still, that is not your job. Your job is to put the information out there and allow individuals to make up their own minds about it. And furthermore, I think what's even worse with the BLM protest is that it's not just that politicians tacitly supported it. They explicitly supported it and were out protesting with BLM protesters during the pandemic.
Whitmer was out there, Mitt Romney was out there.
Yep. At the same, I mean, to be fair to Romney, he wasn't locking people down in his state.
No, he wasn't. That's true. So it is.
And that's the problem with Whitmer. Again, I cut her a lot of slack for her decision making, a cloud of uncertainty. You have a lot of different pressures from constituents, etc. But at the least, don't do something that's so explicitly and publicly hypocritical.
Right. That's the thing that's infuriating, is you try to position yourself as this calm, dispassionate, scientifically based politician, and then you behave in a way that's just clearly partisan. Now, I don't think people should be partisan about these things, but if you're going to be partisan, just admit it. Say, I have these biases and I'm following, like, I'm going to act on these biases. Maybe it's wrong, maybe it's right, but these are where my biases go, right? I think that's the more honest way to do things if you're going to do that, because there are trade-offs. And when you have a lot of uncertainty, inevitably you're going to be guided by priors. But what happens is you get this narrative that progressives' priors are just like neutral, and they therefore confront the data from this just place of open-mindedness, whereas conservatives have these strong priors that distort their informational processing. And that's what causes, I think, a lot of anger and bitterness among intelligent conservatives. Like, I'm not just talking about conservatives who want to troll or own the libs. I mean, we'll ignore that. But there are many intelligent conservatives who found this insufferable for good reason.
Agreed. And also, I mean, there's the infamous example of Gavin Newsom, governor of California, who's instituting strict lockdowns, and then he goes out to a fancy restaurant with some lobbyists or donors.
Right, or Nancy Pelosi getting her hair done.
So
that kind of hypocrisy just ends up reminding you of like the aristocracy in France before the revolution. It's like
it's just like these clueless elites
complete
who are like
double standards.
Like why is anybody interested in the fact that I was eating a steak and then got my hair cut? Like, who cares?
Like, whose business is it that I violate the very principles that I'm laying out for the population to follow, or the very rules, right?
Yes, exactly. So yes, I agree. And I think the thing that's even more mind-boggling to me about the hypocrisy on the COVID response is this is post-Trump. Like, the people are aware that there's this anti-elite populist movement that's gaining in strength and momentum. And even still, these public health experts and politicians are unable to help themselves.
I mean, that's like, you get these problems on both sides where it's kind of like a collective action dilemma, because I think that some smart progressives at least understand that obviously creating more anti-elitist backlash is bad from where they stand. But somebody's going to do it. So it reminds me of, like, if you're concerned about white identity politics, for example, berating white people for being racist is exactly the opposite strategy from what you would want to take. That doesn't stop Robin DiAngelo from writing books about how white people are all racist. So it's just like this collective action problem Or in the case of some of these progressives, I think it's just like a sincere belief that we're not biased, they're biased, and we have to call that out, period. I mean, who cares if they get angry and bitter about it? Too bad. The truth doesn't care.
Yeah. So yes, if these benighted rural racist whites can't understand the distinction between BLM protests
Right.
and the protests that they were doing, that's on the hoi polloi for being simplistic and rustic, not our
Right.
problem.
Yeah.
Same thing with the vaccination the distribution of vaccines. Like, oh, if you can't understand why this equity-based approach to distribution is superior to your simplistic notion of who should get vaccinated first, that's on you for being a racist simpleton, right?
Yeah. I mean,
And if you and there again, if you look at it, both California and New York struggled early on getting vaccines out because it was overly bureaucratic and they had
yeah.
so many weird requirements.
We'll get to that on California because that's an
Yeah.
interesting point in the Klein paper. So let's move on to these Republicans now. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. Most
Yes.
people are hypocritical, but hypocrisy is bad and it should be called out. So we have a Republican civil war, which we've talked about many times,
Yes.
and what lanes are available for 2024, so we can illustrate that or perhaps illuminate these lanes by thinking of some rising stars in the Republican Party. We have in the Trump lane, more people we'll discuss, Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota,
Yes.
Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida,
Yep.
Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, and then we have in the anti-Trump lane, which might not be so much a lane as like a tiny little bike path that you might be able to ride through, but probably not, Ben Sasse, senator from Nebraska. So
Yes.
all of these people are potential candidates for 2024, but I do think that we both agree that probably Sasse has the least is the least likely to be a major player in the primary.
Yeah, so at the end, when we're done discussing them, we'll rank
Okay, fair
our
enough.
probabilities.
All right, so let's go through each of them, I suppose, for like 3 minutes. So
Yeah, let's just start with
who's Kristi Noem?
DeSantis.
Okay, who's DeSantis then?
So DeSantis is the governor of Florida. He was a representative from Florida from 2013 to 2018. Won the governorship by, I think, 0.4% over
Very
Andrew
close
Cuomo.
race, right? And actually, he was projected to lose it.
Yeah, that's right. And so DeSantis is this kind of truculent, Trumpy type figure. And I when you read about what was his kind of policy agenda when he was running for governor, it was mostly being pro-Trump and hurling invective at Democrats for being radical socialists, right? So he's kind of, it's not exactly clear what his favored policies are. He was one of the founding members of the Freedom Caucus when he was a member of the House.
Right. So you might, I think, as with a lot of these figures who are rising in the Trump lane, much of their appeal is aesthetic, right?
Yes.
It's about the sensibility. It's about being bellicose and challenging the media directly, challenging liberals, owning liberals. And
Yes.
DeSantis really has become more popular during the COVID. I mean, he went down in his own state and then went back up. But during the COVID wars, he was kind of the sort of
punching bag of the.
He was the punching bag of the media, but then he was kind of the champion of the more Trump-based approach of being against lockdowns, being against masking or mask mandates at least, right?
And opening the schools.
Opening the schools, blaming the media for distorted and biased coverage, etc. Now, it turns out because of the results in Florida that I think he looks pretty good. Now, I'm not a fan of some of the things that he's done. I think, like, for example, banning mask mandates as a governor, I don't agree with that. I think that's I don't know why you wouldn't let local people decide that.
Right.
And I think
because you shouldn't shame people who don't want to wear masks, man.
Yeah, that's the right. But he's clearly doing this sort of populist on the COVID wars. He's playing the populist game, right?
Yeah, this populist, more libertarian approach. And I would say, I mean, just on the numbers, he does look pretty good. Florida's doing pretty well. Their economy hasn't been set back in the way that some other states have. The pushing hard to open schools was clearly the right move.
Looks like the right thing. I mean, I think there are obviously complicated variables involved. So Florida has different weather.
Right. But I'm saying,
but
if you just look at the metrics,
yes,
he looks good.
If you look at the metrics, he looks good. People are attracted, as populists or people who are sympathetic to populists are attracted to his, anti-media rhetoric, his willingness to stand up and fight. I think they kind of see him as somebody, I see him as somebody who on the policy front will go where the base wants to go. Like, he's not an ideologue. He doesn't have strong views about small government or tax cuts or whatever. He's going to move more with the base, which probably means he'll move more towards economically populist middle class ideas.
Right. And I think one reason, and it's an understandable phenomenon, but one reason that conservatives really like him now is because it's not just that he didn't follow the progressive narrative of how to handle COVID. It's that he was truculent, right, and belligerent about his own approach. Like, he didn't back off and cower the way that conservatives perceived other governors to do.
Yeah, that's right. So he
has this kind of
confidently, he confidently defended himself.
That's right.
And in a world in which there is clearly left-wing media bias, conservatives are attracted to that because you need to stand up for yourself sometimes against this kind of coverage and against these people. Right. So yeah, people are attracted to that. And it ends up, I mean, if he were governor of a state that had the worst record on COVID, he'd look really bad right now.
Yes, he would.
He's not.
Yeah, that's right. And of late, he is promoting a Transparency and Technology Act.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah. So he's joining the kind of populist conservative crusade against big tech.
Right. Big tech censorship is more specifically, right? So
that's right.
I mean, I guess the idea here was that they would be fined severely if they booted off somebody.
Yeah, they had
to have an election.
Right. So the idea is that these platforms would have to have explicit standards for how they banned or deplatformed users, and that if you arbitrarily censored or deplatformed someone, you would be subject to fine.
I think having explicit standards that are clear, and then having some sort of independent body to which you can appeal, those would be good ideas.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
I don't know enough about DeSantis's specific proposal to comment on it intelligently, but I do know that is something that is popular on the right there, because there is this growing skepticism of big tech platforms, not without reason, because these big tech firms tend to be incredibly woke, especially their workforce. So it's understandable that people on the right would be skeptical of them.
Yes, agreed. That's quite understandable. So then we move to
Kristi Noem's sort of similar to DeSantis in that a lot of her appeal is probably aesthetic.
I think the Kristi Noem's kind of the more serious Sarah Palin of the plains, right?
Yes, I think that's a fair. So Kristi Noem's relatively attractive, populist type governor for South Dakota.
Yes.
Who espouses this, I guess what you would call libertarian populism, the kind of get off of my lawn, don't tread on me populism.
Yes, very much so. So it's like this kind of plains libertarian populism that's very like I'm going to protect you, South Dakotans, from abuses of government power.
Right. And also we love your style of life. We love hunters and people
Right.
who like freedom. And those people on the coast, they denigrate and berate you, and we love you. Come to South Dakota.
Yes,
And
that's
we're
right.
champions of fossil fuels and
Yeah.
like all of these things that are sort of conservatives associate or identify with. She applauds and promotes.
Yeah, and she rose to prominence, I think, for three major reasons. One, she's very telegenic.
Yes.
Two, her handling of the COVID pandemic is like the mirror opposite of Cuomo. So it's like the hyper right-wing identity version where no lockdowns, no stay-at-homes, no mask mandate. I trust people in South Dakota to follow the facts and the science. I'm going to present that to you. You make your own decision, right? And then three, the Team Trump views her quite favorably for whatever set of reasons. They really like her. So she's doing this fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago on March 5th. With Don Jr. and the crew over there to help her win re-election. One other note, though. So she has this very libertarian kind of worldview, but the residents of South Dakota by 8% voted to legalize both medical and recreational marijuana, and she was opposed to that. Led the fight against it, and now a court in South Dakota overturned that legislation, and she spoke out favorably for it. So literally one of her 4 pillars of protection is I will protect you from federal intrusion or from government intrusion.
Right.
But she's an advocate of government intrusion if you're tweaking a J on your own property.
Right. So that's why you would call that populist libertarianism, because it's not like Justin Amash style.
That's right. It's not principled
ideological libertarianism. It's more of a temperamental, visceral, I don't like the government elites and the coastal elites fucking with my life libertarianism. That's right. Perfectly willing to allow government interference in many areas so long as they're related to these kinds of values that they have, right?
That's right.
I think the reason she's appealing to Trump people is because she's very clearly just a team player. She's the type of person who's not going to come out and take an ideological stand against something that Team Trump is doing, right?
No, absolutely not.
She is the person who's going to be the loyal subordinate in many ways and just ride that wave comfortably. And therefore they find her appealing. She's not like for some reason the South Carolina governor escapes me. What's the former South Carolina governor, black hair?
I don't know who Nikki Haley?
Nikki Haley. She's not like Nikki Haley, where Nikki Haley has, you can see she's conflicted because she actually did have her own set of ideological concerns that cut against Trumpism. So she says things that are critical of Trump, and the Trump team doesn't like that. They see that she's kind of a wild card. You can't exactly expect her to be entirely loyal. Noem you can expect to be entirely loyal, right?
Yeah.
So no concern there. Now my thought with Noem though, do you think she would hold up on a debate stage?
No,
right?
I think
she doesn't seem particularly.
Lightweight.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I think she's good she's telegenic and she's good when she's making videos of herself and she's not being challenged. I don't see her as somebody who could hold up on a debate stage.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One other thing, though, that's interesting about Noem and what you see here with DeSantis and not Cotton as much because he's in the Senate, but you can see the actual geography of power in the Republican Party shifting to Florida and Mar-a-Lago. So if you look at a lot of these people who are getting geared up for 2024 runs, they're distancing themselves as much as possible from Washington and anything that's going on there. And they're really focusing on building up these connections with Mar-a-Lago and pimping that out, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm Noem. I wasn't a part of that disgusting government, right? Those bureaucrats.
Right. Which I guess would make sense with the hatred of Washington, the rhetoric about the establishment, etc.
But it concerns me because it suggests that the power Trump has over the party is actually going to magnify somewhat.
I think the only realistic hope somebody with the views that I have has is that Trump Sr. gradually ages into senescence and that somebody more serious than Trump Jr. takes over the sort of Trump wing of the party and guides it in a more responsible direction.
Good luck.
We'll see how that works out. Right? But so speaking of that, though, Tom Cotton, whom we talked about a lot last time, he is a senator from Arkansas. And I would say the thing with Cotton that's appealing and interesting is he's more of an intellectual version of Trumpism. That is, he actually had a sort of Trumpist ideology, at least in many ways, before Trump. He was very concerned about immigration. He had some populist leanings. He was a bizarre foreign policy hawk because he wasn't a spread democracy hawk. He was more of a belligerent, we'll make you pay, hit them where it hurts, which actually is coherent and conciliant with sort of Trumpist populist foreign policy.
Right. And another real advantage that Cotton has over both DeSantis and Noem is that he is clearly a heavy hitter.
Right. So he's a political heavyweight. He's thought through these issues. He knows the issues. He's a very educated and intelligent person who I can see comporting himself quite well on a debate stage. And I can see being a serious intellectual force. You wouldn't, he's not somebody you can lightly dismiss.
Right.
He doesn't, he does do some stunts. We talked about writing letters to the New York Times editor or writing this piece on send in the troops. So he's certainly not beyond doing a populist stunt that's sure to anger the establishment. But as a human, you can just tell he's not prone to, what would you say? He's not like an oily sales-like person. He doesn't put on much of an act. He's just really like anti-charismatic in some sense.
Yeah,
right?
Which is one of, I think, his biggest flaws is just that he's bereft of charisma and he doesn't possess like a leadership style that's inspiring.
But so and Isaac Shore at the National Review wrote about him saying many of the things that we had said, right? That he's in this unique position to unify the non-Trump with the Trump wing in the Republican Party because he did not vote against certification. And he's also come out with a bill with none other than Mitt Romney, the most, probably Romney and Sasse are the most anti-Trump Republicans in the Senate. So the fact that Cotton can work with Romney and forward this bill that raises the minimum wage and mandates E-Verify, which is something he cares a lot about, shows that he could unify these wings. And I think that the anti-charisma, we'll have to see how that plays out, but something about Cotton seems very authentic in a way that some people don't, right? Like Marco Rubio, he's very charismatic, but he seems like a phony.
Yeah,
I don't think you can make Cotton look like a phony.
I agree with that, but do you remember that Cotton spoke at the RNC? No, because nobody does, because it was
Yes.
completely forgettable.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
he can't give a good speech. And actually, when you look through the content of that speech, it basically was just accusing Biden of being pro-China and China wanted to elect Biden. But it's so forgettable because he has no delivery.
Yeah, that he's not. Now I like that as a person who wants to support legislative branch supremacy. I'm happy with a very non-charismatic president.
Yes,
but
you have to get there.
Electoral viability is
Right.
obviously a problem. But we'll see. I mean, I think DeSantis. I want to know how he would hold up in a debate as well. But I think DeSantis is more charismatic, clearly, than Cotton. But Cotton's more intellectually serious, and he has years of proving it behind him, right? Like he's somebody you cannot accuse of jumping on the Trump train or becoming a faux populist or something. These are issues he's cared about for a long time. So we'll see how that plays out. Last, Ben Sasse, who is a young 48-year-old senator from Nebraska. He was first elected in 2014. He was a president of a college in Nebraska that had a rather amazing turnaround with him as president. And he was reelected in 2020 despite making very critical comments about Trump. He has written 2 books, including...
No, to be fair, during 2019, Sasse quite deliberately refrained from making...
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, he's not a complete idiot. So
he's not an idiot at all.
Right,
he's a very smart,
very professorial, very smart, very erudite, has a degree in history. He's written 2 books. One, The Vanishing American Adult, about sort of extended adolescence in America, that he
just gave an interview to Politico where he said Matt Gaetz was not an adult.
Right. So he has this view of this extended adolescence, and he thinks that adolescence is good. It's cool that we have this period of time, this transition between being a child and being an adult, but it's become prolonged, and that's the danger. And then he wrote a book called Them, about why we're so polarized, which is a quite good book.
But by the way, just before going to his book on polarization, I like that Sasse is jumping into the intense psychological debate about whether emerging adulthood is a good phase or not.
Yeah, exactly. So he's actually involved in that debate, which is this kind of scholarly debate, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he makes it relevant for ordinary Americans, and he's good at doing this in his books because he's clearly like this kind of professorial guy who he and his research assistants do a good job of going through serious scholarly research, and then he does a good job of communicating it in a kind of ordinary Nebraskan type way. So he's a very serious thinker, but his limitations are he's kind of this neo-Reaganite figure, right? He still believes in that smaller government, localism style of conservatism, which is on its way out probably, right? Or has been eclipsed clearly by this populism that's much more friendly to big government and to using government power to create or pursue the common good, whatever that might be.
And in fact, Sasse summarized his political creed as follows, quote, "We should be trying to explain a Madisonian view of conservatism. That's what I am. Limited government, the First Amendment, and local community is primary."
Right.
So it's a very principled small government view. And in fact, so much so that Sasse really identifies more as a conservative than as a Republican. And
Right.
again, that's that while conservatives, principled conservatives like that, I think that's a weakness in a time of hyper partisanship.
Yeah, it very clearly is, because you can think of just the coalitionary brain. If you're a coalitionary Republican, you look at Sasse as somebody who's willing to defy the coalition when it's convenient for Sasse. That's how you look at it.
Right.
Of the actual reasons he's doing it. So yes, I think that is a liability. Also, I think there's something laudable about one of Sasse's major themes is that politics plays an outsized role in our lives, and we'd actually be much better off if we paid less attention to it and made fewer things political and paid more attention to our communities and to accomplishing things and to going to church. And
as the co-host of a political podcast, I vehemently disagree with him.
Right. Well, he's a senator, so he's got his own conflict there. But this is an argument that goes all the way back to, for example, Benjamin Constant, who made the argument that an important kind of freedom that modern liberalism, small L liberalism, promotes is this kind of civic freedom in which you don't have to participate in politics, right? So Constant compared that to old Greek style liberty. Greek style liberty, you were inevitably political. There was no escaping politics. You were expected to be a political creature. Now you're not, and that's a good thing. Or, I mean, there are trade-offs, but Sasse thinks that's a good thing, and that it's actually bad when we become more political because we become more divided. We're not working together to build things that really provide meaning in people's lives, such as family and church, etc. Now, Sasse has been critical of Trump. I mean, he's a politician, so he's tried to avoid unnecessarily immolating his career, right? But he has been critical of Trump, especially after the Capitol riot. He denounced Trump pretty forcefully, and then he voted to convict him in the impeachment trial. So that's also something that obviously will probably be a liability in 2024.
In fact, he's going to be censured by the Nebraska Republican Party today.
Yeah, well, he came out with a video basically saying, go ahead and censure me. Politics is not, or conservatism is not about the weird worship of one dude. The fact that Sasse's intellectual arguments are correct doesn't mean a whole lot in the world, unfortunately. So Sasse is probably the most prominent and likely of anti-Trump contenders. I just don't think there's going to be an anti-Trump lane. I just don't see it.
No, I mean, I think one thing that becomes evident as you look into more detail at rising conservative stars is that they all want to be the Trumpy candidate. They all want to be more Trump than the other candidates. Like Kristi Noem's, I'm going to out Trump you.
Right.
You know, DeSantis, look at the way he campaigned. It was like they sent like all of this, you know, these emails out to their supporters that just had like Trump on them, and Trump supports me, Trump loves me.
Right. And there's this
and Cotton refuses to criticize Trump ever.
Right, but he does. But Cotton, again, he's the one out of the Trump loyalists who's sort of I think the most responsible about it.
Oh, I don't disagree. It's just
inevitable that Trump loyalty, it seems, is going to determine one's ability to rise in the Republican Party.
I strongly suspect right now that Trump will run again, and he'll probably, I mean, if he runs, I think
if he runs, he wins.
Yes, and I think he will run. Why wouldn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he'll be 78.
Yep.
I mean, that's old. Obviously, Biden won, and he was very old too. But also,
Trump is like preternaturally energetic for a 74 or 5-year-old, though. It's
he
actually
is,
kind of freakish.
he is, but decline can happen really quickly when you're at that age. It's
Not
like,
when you're eating McDonald's every day.
but also, although again, I agree with you that if he runs, he would almost, I mean, he'd have to be the heavy betting favorite to win the primary. I just
Yes.
don't see him as being nationally viable because
It doesn't matter.
I know it doesn't, but I mean, the January 6th riot hurts him, and he was
Yes.
already incredibly unpopular nationally.
Yes.
And he has to take your adverb, he has the preternatural ability to turn out voters who dislike him.
Yes. Yes. But the primaries, it doesn't matter. And in fact, I kind of suspect that Noem's running more to be his vice presidential pick.
Okay, so yeah, let's make our bets here.
Yes.
So I'm gonna say okay, so the person with the best chance out of the four, I think, is Tom Cotton
to win the
presidency. Yes, to win nomination.
Let's go nomination, not presidency.
So I would go Cotton, DeSantis, Noem, Sasse. That would be my order.
Okay.
I could be wrong on this, and we'll see. I don't think Trump will run in 2024 because I think he'll be much older. He's already, it's not that he's lazy, it's that he's very unfocused. And I'm not even sure that he wants to put in the focused effort to try to marshal a campaign. What I think he likes is being this source of massive influence in the Republican Party. So I think he'll be, again, I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not very confident of this, but I think he'll be content being the kingmaker in Mar-a-Lago, and somebody else will carry the populist banner. And I'm predicting that will be Hawley.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about Hawley, but I think looking at it and looking at these people, I think Hawley wins 2024.
Wait,
that's
so
my prediction.
You just break the rules and go out?
I'm breaking the rules because I'm breaking my own prediction, which used to be Cotton, because I think this is what I think. I think by 2024, people will forget about what Hawley did with voting against certification.
The Trump loyalists will love him for it still.
Right. So the people who would object to him will forget about that. And I think actually Hawley behind the scenes will make some peace with them and will try to make some kind of bill or something or work with them to establish that he can unite the Republican Party. And Hawley is just more talented than Cotton. That's the way I look at it. I'm like, okay, both of them are serious intellectual populists, but Hawley's got more talent. Hawley is a very talented political figure.
Also, I think
he doesn't make. Sorry, go ahead.
Hawley is the more genuine economic populist.
That's right. So Cotton on the economics is a little bit neither here nor there. That's not clearly what he cares about as much as Hawley does. And so I think Hawley's somebody that intelligent conservatives at the National Review, even though they disapproved of some of his antics, they'll forget about that. And they can definitely approve of him as a populist conservative leader because he's a very smart person who has a coherent ideology. I mean, I like him because he's a strong immigration restrictionist.
He's very similar in many ways to Teddy Roosevelt. I'm not saying he is Teddy Roosevelt.
Who's his hero, clearly.
Right. But he has the narcissistic temperament. He's a genius.
Right. Yes.
He doesn't really, he's perfectly comfortable pulling political stunts, doesn't really care, likes trolling people, has a coherent populist perspective.
Yep.
likes, tweeting about the excesses of capitalism and big businesses, right?
Yes.
Which
Yes.
separates him from DeSantis and Noem, who would not be caught dead doing that. The other thing, I'm going to agree with your choice of Hawley.
Yeah. Also, he's actually, Cotton and Romney come out with this this increase of minimum wage to $10 plus E-Verify.
Hawley says,
sees that
I
and
got
says,
you
"Fuck
beat.
you! I'll do better than you.
Yes.
I'll rip up the corporations that all of the conservative populists hate, say that they have to pay $15, and then come out with a minimum wage plan that actually does a better job of it because it does it via taxes."
Yes.
Instead of being a killer for small businesses, this is something that taxes people and then gives money to, it makes up the difference. Now,
That's right.
The interesting thing with this is basically explicit red state versus blue state, because what Hawley understands here is that increasing the minimum wage is essentially a tax on small businesses. So if you increase the minimum wage, you're punishing a lot of small businesses, especially in red states. If you make it a tax, you're actually transferring money from blue states to red states.
That's right.
The problem with his plan, and we obviously, maybe we can talk about it next week or something, but his plan is more complicated. And I think that's the problem with it.
Yeah.
But as an idea, it's more appealing to me.
Yeah, I agree. Another interesting thing I think about Hawley, because I was thinking about this yesterday when I was kind of assessing these different Republicans. One thing that paradigm changing presidents are very good at is using the latest communications technology. So Roosevelt with the radio, Reagan with television.
Right.
Hawley is really good at using social media.
Yes.
For good and ill.
Right.
Cotton really is not, right?
No, again, Cotton just isn't charismatic in general. So
kind of stilted. And
yeah. I mean, I could see him winning, but again, if I'm predicting now, I predict Hawley wins 2024 nomination, and then I vote for him.
So I would go in order: Trump Jr., Hawley, and then it's not going to be Cotton, because if Trump isn't in the mix, he wants to be the kingmaker, and I don't think he would want Cotton to win. I think he wants somebody who's more of an acolyte. So that would either be Hawley, DeSantis, or Noem, potentially. And then Sasse, I agree with you. Sasse is the least likely. Sasse has
virtually
there's
no
just
chance, right?
Yeah, I mean, how's that going to happen?
Don Jr. I don't think Don Jr. will run, because I think he realizes that, I think actually his dad realizes also that he's a political liability. If you watch his speeches,
they're bad. They're
really bad. And I think he knows it. And I think his dad knows it. And I think one of the things that's important for sort of the MAGA brand is you don't want to get humiliated like that. And if you run Don Jr. and he gets beat by somebody, that looks really bad.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think Don Jr. doesn't run because I think Don Jr. knows his own limitations, which are incredibly severe here.
I think that Trump runs. I really do.
Okay, that's fair. So I think
I just think
you think Trump.
Yeah, the last 2 months, the Republican Party had the chance to expedite the Civil War, and we would see what happened there if there was like a new centrist kind of party or not. They didn't do it. It's Trump's party now, and I just think he will run. He's extremely popular. Another
problem with Trump's running, though, is that I think if he ran in 2024, that would be, the Republican Civil War would be total and complete at that point, because if Trump runs, because if Trump runs, there's no unifying those Republicans anymore. I think there are a lot of Republicans.
Who's going to resist Trump running?
I think a lot of people will. No, Ben Sasse, a lot of intellectuals.
Three senators, maybe?
No,
3 or 4?
If you're talking about, let's say you're talking about even 1% of voters, that's a big deal. 1% is a lot. So you could see if you ran a Cotton or a Hawley, you can actually unify the Republican Party. If you run Trump, you're not going to. It's going to be over. And the people like Romney and Sasse and maybe some others will have to make a decision.
I disagree. The Republican Party will be more unified around Trump in 2024 than they were around him in 2016.
No, not a chance. No way.
Okay.
After 7 senators voted to convict him of impeachment, they'll be more unified?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
I find that very hard.
Were those 7 senators supportive of him in 2016?
They weren't openly hostile to him.
Yeah, I just don't think those senators matter that much. Like, what are they going to do?
I again, like it's at the margins. You're just talking about, like, if you had to run somebody in 2024 against, say, Harris, let's say Harris is the presumptive Democratic nominee.
Yes.
Who would you run if you wanted to win the election?
Somebody who was a moderate centrist to win the general election?
Earnestly to win it, yeah. Who potentially could win?
You mean somebody who would win the primary first?
Who could win the primary, yeah.
I would, against Harris, probably Hawley. I don't know.
Right. So would I. I would run Hawley. Why? Because Hawley can unify the National Review types. He can unify people in the Congress behind him. These people won't feel completely embarrassed, ashamed supporting a Republican. If you run Trump against Harris, I would put my money on Harris, because I think if you run Trump now, you're going to shed even more voters from the suburbs, and you will cause a splinter, the Republican Party will be torn asunder. Now, I agree with you. You're only talking about a tiny little island floating off from the Republican Party.
Right.
But that's a tiny island you could have if you ran Hawley.
Don't disagree, but Trump still has the advantage in the primary because he's Trump.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree that could Hawley even, this is the thing that I thought about, and I guess we'll move on after this. Could any of these people legitimately even challenge Trump in a primary, given that they've basically claimed utter fidelity to him?
No, that's the problem, is that none of them could challenge him. It's only
because what would they say?
You'd have nothing. I mean, as soon as Hawley threw his hat in the ring, if Trump was going to run, he would lose most of his voters.
Right. So it would basically be, these people would be competing to be his vice president.
Right. And that's where I think actually, so let's say that Trump runs. If he runs, and we don't have to pursue this derivation, but if he ran, I would say like Noem's in a good spot there. Like, have this attractive, telegenic woman from South Dakota on your ticket. Cool.
I agree. But I think if Trump tried to run in 2024, you would create a resistance that would make 2020 look light.
Oh, I agree.
You would have such a backlash that it would be devastating.
But here's the problem: when you have a party that becomes really like insular and anti-institutional, they don't really care about running the best candidates.
No, they care. They just can't do anything about it.
Right. Well, a lot of people don't care. They care about running the most Trumpy or like the most troll the libs candidate.
Sure. But Republican people who are smart, intelligent people in the Republican Party do not want Trump.
Oh, I agree. But here's the problem. Any of these candidates who are Trumpy, I think, will do a good job turning out the resistance, right? Because they will be so associated with Trump and Trumpism, especially Hawley, because he did want to not certify the results.
Yeah, he will not turn it out the way Trump would, though. But yes, I agree.
How many advertisements are there going to be of the raised fist?
There'll be a lot of them, obviously.
Yeah. So
so anyway, you're picking Trump. I'm picking Hawley. Mark it down. We'll see who's right.
That's right.
Moving on finally to this. this is an interesting pair of articles. The article, I guess, of the week is this Ezra Klein article. You can explain what this Ezra Klein article, what is its major argument?
Well, first, it's entitled "California is Making Liberals Squirm," and it was written in the New York Times. And the basic thesis, I would say, is that even though California is an extremely explicitly progressive state and they vote Democrat,
Yes,
they're operationally conservative and temperamentally conservative. So what you have are progressive ideals combined with high rates of poverty, high levels of inequality,
yes,
dilapidated schools, students aren't back in school, you've had this botched vaccine rollout, etc.
yes.
I think that's the main kind of thesis.
So the article starts with this. So there was this school in San Francisco, or I'm sorry, there were the Board of Education in San Francisco voted to strip a lot of schools of their names and to change their names, including Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Paul Revere even got thrown in. Just bizarre.
Wasn't Dianne Feinstein?
These were people who were somehow tainted by their treatment of victims groups.
Yes.
And when they attempted to articulate, there were I think it was the head of the Board of Education, or the woman who was in charge of this, had an interview in which she was attempting to defend changing the names, and it was completely incoherent. There was no intellectual defense of it, and in fact, they got a lot of the facts wrong in their document defending it. So Klein starts with this. This is this very progressive, we're going to change these names because they're racist. But they can't even get the schools open, despite the fact that the best evidence suggests kids should be in school. And in fact, the people who are hurt the most by at-home schooling are a lot of these vulnerable groups, right? Yes. So this is progressivism in your face, but in reality, it's not so much progressivism, or it's operationally not progressivism. Another fact that Klein points to is that 48% of San Francisco is white, but only 15% of kids enrolled in public schools are white. So in other words, the progressives who constantly denigrate private schools all send their kids to private schools, right?
Yes.
And only 15% participate in the public school.
Yes. So important to this is that Klein's argument is this is not true progressivism.
Right, exactly. So he says this is actually what's happening here is it's people who proclaim themselves to be progressive behaving conservatively, not conservatively in the small taxes way, but conservatively in the stand athwart change, saying stop, he says. So this is a more temperamental conservatism. Now he makes, so that's his argument, right? Now there's this response by Kevin Williamson, and I think we can do this before we get back to some problems with Klein's arguments.
Yes.
So Kevin Williamson wrote this piece for the National Review, which is feisty as always, arguing that rhetorician Ezra Klein, not policy wonk, but rhetorician Ezra Klein, misunderstands what's happening in California, right? And so what Williamson says is that actually California is exactly what you get with progressivism.
Yeah, that's key, is that Williamson views California as progressives creating progressivism.
Right, like this is exactly what conservatives warn you about when they warn about progressivism.
Importantly, regulatory capture, unintended consequences, political incentives, revealed preferences, all of these things that conservatives have harped on for decades are evidenced in California.
Right. So for example, we'll just take the schooling one, that's revealed preferences. So you talk a big game, you rail against private schools, but in fact, when push comes to shove, people who have money want their kids to go to private schools. So what this really amounts to is private schools for my kids, public schools for your kids, right?
Right.
And this
And
is exactly the kind of
the-
hypocrisy, the double standard that conservatives have pointed out and railed against for many years.
Right. And then the fact that you don't have students in the classroom right now is regulatory capture,
Yes.
right? Because
Right.
these unions have complete control over whether the school's open or not, and they're trying to protect their members.
Right. So I will say Williamson makes some good arguments. The bad argument that I don't like, here's Williamson's basic framework. And this has been his framework for a long time. It's something that he writes about quite often. His argument is there's no such thing as like a detached or dispassionate approach to evidence and evidence-based policy. There are biases one way, biases the other way, right? And
Yes.
What's obnoxious about people like Klein is they conceive of themselves as dispassionate, progressive technocrats who just follow the evidence, when
right.
actually they just have their own bundle of biases that they pursue, and conservatives have a different bundle of biases.
Yes.
I think that argument, although there's clearly truth to it, is somewhat unfair, because I sort of think to myself, look, like, yes, everybody has their biases, but clearly the goal should be to look at the evidence as dispassionately as possible and try to follow it. So,
Yes.
I mean, I think that's what we should try to do.
I think the other unfair argument that Williamson makes toward the end of his essay is that intentions don't matter.
Which is actually an argument, by the way, that Klein made.
Right, that's exactly what I was going to say. So Williamson makes this argument, we shouldn't pay attention to intentions because everybody has, noble motivations, etc.
Right.
That's one of Klein's problems. What we should do is just look at outcomes.
Right.
But that's actually the argument Klein makes at the end of the essay, is we should stop paying attention to people's self-proclaimed intentions. Those don't matter. Let's pay attention to outcomes.
Yeah, in fact, it was bizarre. I was like, did Williamson stop reading the Klein article before the end? Because Klein makes exactly this point, citing none other than Ibram Kendi.
I suspect so. Furthermore, another problem that I have with Williamson's mode of argumentation is it's all fine and well to use these conservative buzzwords such as unintended consequences and regulatory capture, but you could apply that to any state or any city, right? It's not clear how this differentiates California from Texas.
Right. So let's say, so we think Williamson's unfair in that, or he's mistaken that we should just admit that it's just a bundle of biases clashing. Like, yes, people have their biases, but we should look at the evidence and attempt to adjust our priors accordingly and deal with the world in an evidence-based way. That's one. Two.
Well, in fact, right.
Hold on though. Let's organize this. So two, he makes this claim about intentions that actually is exactly what Klein says, right?
Right.
And then three, it's not clear what the difference would be in so what would the conservatives' approach to California be? I mean, why is it, if we accept that there's a lot of inequality there, and in fact, what's happening is that these kids are going to private schools anyway, how would that be different if you followed conservative policies there? I'm not sure about that.
Somewhat unclear. Furthermore, the entire point of Klein's essay is, if you look at the actual evidence, it suggests that these policies are not working in the way that I, as a progressive, would want them to.
Right.
So what is Williamson talking about? I'm not really sure.
So I will say here, so Klein, so I think what Williamson is angered about is this idea that Klein is blaming this on excessive conservatism, right?
Right. I think that's why
you have these problems. And I don't think Williamson likes that. And
Yes.
there's one case that you could point out where I don't understand the argument. So Klein looks at, for example, the vaccine rollout and
Yes.
how all of these sort of weird rules made it inefficient and
Yes.
clumsy. I'm not sure, why is that the fault of excessive temperamental conservatism? Right? That actually
Yeah.
seems to me that is the byproduct of progressivism. You're trying to make too many rules and do these equity things instead of just making simpler rules and rolling it out.
Right. And I think the same would go for the inability of California to build high-speed rail.
Exactly.
Right.
That's another
Too
one.
many regulations, the conservative approach would just be, look, like if we can get funding for this, let's just build it.
Right. Like, let's get rid of some of these onerous regulations and build stuff. So I think there, if Williamson had just made that argument, like, look, some of these things that Klein is blaming on excessive operational conservatism, they're actually a byproduct of excessive progressivism, and they're bad. And if we followed the policies that conservatives prefer, we'd actually have a better California, even by Ezra Klein's standards.
Right. Yes, I agree with that. The problem is that Williamson's not very good at, or I guess maybe doesn't even try to make systematic arguments.
Right.
And so it's hard to tell exactly what his point is, except for slapping Klein down.
Yeah, so I think the thing that's odd about the Klein article, which a lot of people were talking about it, so it was an interesting, thought-provoking piece, is just it evinces some of the lack of self-reflection that you see in Klein's book on polarization, in which he positions himself as this thoughtful person who's willing to criticize his own side, but then you can see how incredibly blinkered he is by his ideology. And so he can't see that this actually what's going on is this too conservative argument doesn't really work for a lot of these things. And the school choice thing, for example, this is individuals making choices. How would you stop that if you were more progressive? What would you do? Would you force these families to go to public school?
I think maybe his argument would be, if you had more public investment in schools, the public school quality would increase.
Possibly that would be, because that's often a progressive argument is,
Right.
if you had more. Right. And so, so I think that's the sort of limitation of Klein's argument. Williamson's argument, which I have a little more sympathy for if I fleshed it out myself, I think is even more uncharitable as he wrote it, because it's just clearly this visceral anger bubbling up from Williamson's pen, which often is how he writes, which is,
yes.
Klein is this poser. He's this rhetorician who claims to be this dispassionate policy analyst, and he doesn't understand anything about this. And he's just trying to blame conservatism for all of these problems that are actually the fault of progressivism, exactly as people like me have been warning you for 25 years.
Right. And that's kind of this Williamson theme, right? Is that you can just go around the United States and identify failing states, communities, and cities and say, the reason they're failing is because progressivism. So he did the same thing with Detroit.
Yes.
He wrote a large piece on Illinois, that it's a failed state because of progressivism.
Right. And this is what's irritating about the people who do this. And they're like, oh, red state better, or blue state failing progressivism, is one, a lot of these blue states are incredibly successful by any kind of measure.
Right. There's no explanatory power to
right.
To
and then two, there's no explanatory power, and you ignore all of these other variables such as demographics, etc. It is kind of
right. So
I would say,
Williamson doesn't explain why Finland and Sweden, for example, seem to do so well,
right?
But Illinois and Detroit don't.
Right.
And if also, he did, he'd probably make some specious argument about how Sweden actually is like very pro free market.
Right.
which fine.
In the same way, Klein makes that actually their conservative argument
Right.
when progressivism fails. And interestingly, like so California is a mixed bag, but in many ways, it's obviously a highly successful state. I think the thing that's embarrassing to progressives is that you have all of these intractable problems that many people on the right have been arguing your diagnosis of the problem is wrong, right? So inequality, for example, if you don't look at demographics, you look at immigration rates and how many Hispanics are in California, clearly that's a large part of the story of inequality. And
yes,
because progressives don't want to grapple with that, they're going to have to blame it on something else.
right. So you have, I think the demographics are a large component of the explanation. And then also not having a manufacturing base is important, because that's one sector of the economy that supplies relatively high paying jobs to people who are not, highly intelligent or don't have a lot of economic skills, right?
Right.
So, right. But I guess the problem to me ultimately is that neither Williamson nor Klein are actually grappling with what leads to these outcomes, like inequality and homelessness and poverty, right? They're kind of...
I agree. I think that they're kind of both, focusing on superficial variables and not paying attention to the deeper variables and not grappling with those. I think it's fair to chastise Klein for blaming all of the failures in California on temperamental conservatism, as if conservatism's a problem, in the same way that it's fair to chastise Williamson for blaming, say, Detroit's failures on progressivism. Because, like, would you say the same thing about Carmel, California, which is an incredibly affluent and very hippie-esque kind of progressive hub, is like very successful? I mean, yeah, so neither of them are grappling with the actual causal variables or relevant variables, probably.
Right. And I think this idea of like looking at, we saw this play out in Texas as well, where Texas has this real complex issue that causes them to lose power. And there are a lot of factors involved. It's not like something you can look at and just be like deregulation.
Right.
And what happens is then liberals go and they say, oh, look at this red state failure. This proves that deregulation and privatization is bad. Right. And then you have the conservatives who are like, this was because of the Green New Deal.
Right.
Right. And, and again, what we would want is if we want to understand what's going wrong with California, to the extent that we think there's a problem. I mean, a lot of people in California are perfectly happy. Right. But to the extent,
I guess people leave, 130,000 more people leave the state each year than come to the state. So you could argue that I mean, maybe that's evidence of a problem. I mean, really, to me, it's probably the cost that's force or driving people away, right? Because the median house in California is $700,000.
Yeah. So if, I mean, yes, a lot of people, the revealed preference is they would prefer to live in Boise, Idaho.
Yeah. Or Arizona, right? Or, if you like the nice weather, it's obviously Arizona is not as nice as California because California is more temperate, but still you have nice warm weather and it's much less expensive.
Right. So, I mean, I think California there are many factors at work. Williamson identifies, I think, a few of them that are important. Klein, actually, it's unclear to me, like with Klein's piece, because he doesn't really offer any solutions policy-wise, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, just to take the concrete example of the schools. So what's the solution there? I mean,
or the homelessness, or inequality, or
build more houses, because he says that, like Newsom said he was going to build X amount of houses, and they've only built like 100,000 a year, I think, since Newsom took over.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's just, again, it's kind of unclear. And it's also unclear to me from Klein's perspective what progressive solutions to those problems would look like. I think you mentioned that, like with the private schools, like what would it
Right.
even what does the progressive solution look like? What I think we should do is you would look at, like, citizens or residents of the state should think about, well, what outcomes do we actually want? And then what is the best way to get there? And if the residents of California overall are happy with their level of inequality, or the fact that the housing market is extremely expensive, that's fine with me.
Yeah, it's fine with
Like,
me
okay,
too. I mean, I think then what's embarrassing for progressives is that these are people who proclaim themselves champions of the working class. They're concerned with inequality and all of these things, and then actually, when they govern, they preside over a state that has the worst level of inequality, incredibly high levels of poverty. And so they're essentially showing that their ideology is it's either a lie, or it's maybe a lie is the wrong way to put it, but it's somewhat deceptive, or it's a failure, or it can't actually handle the problems that they proclaim themselves to want to handle.
yeah, I agree with that. And I think the more extreme versions of progressivism, as with more extreme versions of socialism, do actually lead to complete failure.
Yes, and they lead
Because
to failure and hypocrisy because you promote one thing while living a completely different thing.
that's right. But I don't. I mean, for my biggest critique of Williamson actually is I just don't like his style of debate, which is very ad hominem.
Yeah, I agree. I don't understand that. There's no need for it. I mean, it's not edifying. There's no need to call Klein a rhetorician instead of.
No, and furthermore, I mean, the problem when you're somebody like Williamson is, if he had a debate with Klein, Klein would utterly eviscerate him, because Klein actually knows the ins and outs of hundreds
Yeah,
of complex policies,
yeah,
whereas Williamson doesn't.
I agree. So Williamson is more of a temperamental thinker. That is to say, he has these biases and ideas. He's not a wonk. Klein does know the details. I disagree with Klein on a lot of things, but I have zero doubt that if Williamson and Klein debated, Klein would win, because he's clearly masters more areas of policy data. He knows the data better. He knows the debates better. He knows the history better of specific policies.
Yes, and I also give Klein credit for writing the piece, because I think it's a good idea to point out failures or seeming failures from your own side.
Right, except for this is where I think, and I sort of defend Williamson's anger here. I think Williamson's anger is piqued by this attempted confession from a progressive that California is actually embarrassing progressivism, that ends up being an attack on conservatism, because it says the problem is really conservatism.
Right.
Right. So I think Williamson is irked by that because it blames conservatism for the failures of progressives.
Yeah, agreed. So they're having like this no true Scotsman debate, right?
Yeah, as Williamson, I think at some point says or something. So, or does he say that in there? Maybe he doesn't.
I don't think so.
Okay, yeah, but yes, there is a bit of that, as a lot of like definitional. But yeah, I do agree that it's good to be self-critical and to think about, okay, California is actually not living up to these values. Why?
Yeah, and I also think, and this would be a broader conversation, but I do think it's important. This is what happens when you have a debate among people who don't recognize that important traits are not equally distributed in people or across demographic groups. And that is extremely important if you want to have a serious discussion about inequality.
That's a pervasive problem, obviously.
It is, but it's unfortunate because I mean, we could.
You don't even need to, talk about the cause of the different distribution.
No,
just knowing
not
that
at all.
there are underlying differences. If you don't accept that, you're not talking about reality, right?
Right, and accepting that accounts for why many areas in California have this extreme, like high level of inequality and poverty, but Vancouver doesn't. Right.
And it's also a reason that a lot of people are skeptical of incredibly generous immigration policies, because you end up getting a lot of people with low skills, like that don't have a lot of education, they have low skills. They come in, and then that creates massive inequality, because the wealthy people in California are perfectly happy to pay cheaper prices for various goods and various services, but obviously that creates a growing divide.
Right, you create like this two-tiered economy, but it is
can cause the coming neo-feudalism.
That's right, but it is worth noting that with like Vancouver, because if you look at Vancouver, they have some of the most onerous regulations about building in the known, like any cities that I know, like extreme height regulations, etc. You could apply all of the Williamson critique to Vancouver, but you wouldn't, because Vancouver's very functional and people aren't complaining about it.
Yeah.
Right?
So you see, you're there. If you looked at cities in California, you could find these differences too, right?
Right.
And the underlying variable that is probably the most explanatory is demographics, but of course, nobody wants to touch those when they're having
demographics,
and
then overall distribution of IQ and conscientiousness as well.
Oh, right. So I guess what you would say is just the distribution of human capital, put it the most abstractly, right?
Right. And I think it's very frustrating though, when you read these back and forth and these debates about this was a conservative failure, this is a liberal failure, because you aren't really making contact with the key explanatory variable, with the fact that, look, you can have all the regulatory capture in the world in this city where everybody has an IQ above 115 and it works just fine, right? They're able to manage the regulatory capital and it's okay.
The regulatory capture,
yes.
Right. So that's why if you're actually going to have a serious debate about the efficacy of various policies, you have to look at and control for demographics and say, well, what happens in two areas that are roughly the same in terms of distribution of human capital if you enact these policies? That's what you'd want to look at, obviously.
Right. And that's why, I mean, when we talked about the spatial inequality a couple of weeks back, one of the keys to alleviate it is to distribute human capital more equitably around the United States. If you don't do that, these problems are really unsolvable, right? So it really does amount to, if we want West Virginia to have a more vibrant economy, how can we attract talented people to West Virginia who can build functional institutions?
Right. And inevitably, unless you have an absolutely draconian tax system that redistributes wealth, and I don't even know how that would work, inevitably, if you have the distribution of human capital that you have in California, you're going to have enormous inequality. It's just inevitable, right? There's no avoiding that. That's not a policy failure. I mean, you could argue that there are things you could do better. That's fine. But that inequality is not necessarily a policy failure. It's
not necessarily, but it creates negative externalities when you have the level of inequality that you get in, like, say, like Chicago, because you have a lot of talented people who grow up in the south side of Chicago, where you have, on average, very low levels of human capital. who actually face like, drugs, crime, etc., that does actually impede their ability to maximize their
thrive
potential.
and flourish. Yeah. So right. Agreed. So that's obviously we're not going to solve that problem.
No, we're not. But these are things to actually like that you would want people to think about very carefully and to have debates about, rather than the Williamson Klein debate over whether this is conservative or progressive.
Right. Nevertheless, I'll say the pieces aren't terribly long and they're at least, moderately entertaining. So worth reading.
Yes, agreed. So we'll be back next week to discuss the news of the week.